I always liked camping alone. It wasn't that I didn't enjoy company, but there was something about being out in the wilderness with nothing but my own thoughts and the quiet hum of nature that felt right. I had been camping for years, ever since I was a kid. My dad had taken me on my first trip when I was 8, and I had been hooked ever since. By the time I was in my late 30s, I had lost count of how many times I had gone out into the wild, setting up camp miles away from the nearest road, away from any signs of civilization. I liked the solitude, the challenge of surviving on my own, and the peace that came with being completely off the grid. That's why, when I decided to take a trip to the dense forests of northern Montana, I didn't hesitate. I had been there once before, years ago, and I remembered how untouched it felt. No marked trails, no designated campsites, just miles and miles of raw wilderness. It was exactly the kind of place I wanted to be. I packed light but smart. A sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for the cold nights, a solid hunting knife, a small axe for cutting wood, a water purifier, and enough food to last me a week. I had a map, but I rarely relied on it. I had a good sense of direction and a GPS just in case. My plan was simple. Hike deep into the woods, set up camp by a small river I had marked on my map, and spend a few days enjoying the solitude before heading back. I started early in the morning. The hike was tough, but I had done worse. The terrain was steep in some areas, with thick underbrush that made progress slow. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. By mid-afternoon, I had reached the river. It was just as I remembered. Cold, clear water cutting through the forest, surrounded by towering pines and thick brush. I found a good spot to set up camp, a small clearing about 50 feet from the water, with a natural windbreak formed by a rock outcropping. It was perfect. I spent the rest of the day setting up camp, gathering firewood, and making sure everything was secure. By nightfall, I had a small fire going and was cooking one of my meals over it. The temperature had dropped, but the fire kept me warm. I sat there for a long time, just listening to the sounds of the forest, the occasional rustling in the underbrush, the distant hoot of an owl, the steady flow of the river. It wasn't until I was about to turn in for the night that I noticed something strange. The forest had gone silent. I didn't think much of it at first. Sometimes the sounds of nature came and went. But as I listened, I realized that it wasn't just a brief lull. There was nothing. No wind in the trees, no insects buzzing, no movement in the brush. It was as if everything had stopped. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. But I had been camping long enough to know that when the forest goes silent, something is usually wrong. It could be a predator, maybe a bear, maybe a mountain lion. I reached for my knife and kept it close as I crawled into my tent. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening. Every now and then, I thought I heard something, faint, almost like footsteps, but not quite. It was too irregular, too deliberate. But every time I sat up to listen, it was gone. Eventually, I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The sun was just starting to rise, casting long shadows through the trees. Everything felt normal again. Birds were chirping, and the forest had come back to life. I convinced myself that it had just been my imagination and went about my day. I spent the morning fishing in the river and caught a decent-sized trout. I cleaned it, cooked it over the fire, and ate in silence. The day passed without incident. I hiked around, explored the area, and enjoyed the solitude. By evening, I was back at my campsite, watching the fire crackle as the sky darkened. That's when I noticed it. There was something in the trees. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, but the more I looked, the more certain I became. There was something standing just beyond the tree line, barely visible in the fading light. It wasn't an animal. It was tall, too tall to be anything normal. I couldn't make out any details, just a dark shape standing motionless among the trees. My heart started pounding. I reached for my knife again, gripping it tightly. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I just sat there, staring at whatever it was. Then, as quickly as I had noticed it, it was gone. I stayed up late that night, keeping the fire high. Every now and then, I thought I heard something. Faint rustling, distant movement, but nothing ever came close. By the third day, I was on edge. Every little sound put me on alert. I kept scanning the trees, looking for anything unusual. I didn't see the figure again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, I barely slept. I kept my knife within arm's reach and woke up every hour, listening. The silence would come and go, and every time it did, I felt my skin crawl. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was cutting my trip short. I packed up quickly, checking my surroundings every few minutes. I kept my knife out as I started the long hike back. The whole time, I felt like I was being followed. I didn't see anything, didn't hear anything, but the feeling never left me. As I got closer to where I had parked, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There were tracks, not animal tracks, footprints, human, but they weren't mine, and they weren't fresh. They had been there before I arrived. I stared at them, my stomach twisting. They led into the forest, toward where I had been camping. Whoever or whatever had been out there had been there before I even arrived. I didn't stop to think. I kept moving, walking faster, pushing through the last stretch of the hike until I finally saw my truck. I threw my gear into the back, climbed in, and drove away without looking back. I don't know what was out there. I don't know if it was a person or something else. I just know that something had been watching me the entire time. And the worst part? I hadn't been alone in those woods, not even from the start. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend away from everything. I had planned it for weeks. Just me, my tent, and the sound of rain in the middle of nowhere. I always loved the rain, especially while camping. Something about being tucked away in a tent, listening to the steady drumming on the canvas, made me feel at peace. I had chosen a spot deep in the woods, far from any main roads or crowded campsites. It wasn't an official camping ground, just a clearing near a slow-moving river that I had found on a map. The weather forecast predicted rain, but I didn't mind. I had my gear, enough food for a couple of days, and a reliable old truck that had never let me down. I arrived in the early afternoon, just as the sky turned gray. The air smelled like wet earth, and the wind carried the scent of pine and damp leaves. I parked my truck at the edge of the clearing and got to work setting up my tent. The ground was damp but not soaked, and I managed to get everything up before the rain started. By the time I got a small fire going, the first drops were falling. I sat on a foldable camping chair, listening to the distant sound of rain moving through the trees. It started slow, just a light drizzle, but by the time the sun dipped below the treetops, it had turned into a steady downpour. I moved inside my tent, zipped it up tight, and stretched out on my sleeping bag. The rain hit the fabric in a soothing rhythm, and I felt myself relax. I had a small lantern for light and a book to pass the time, but after a while I just lay there listening to the storm. It must have been close to midnight when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. At first I thought it was just the wind or an animal moving through the undergrowth, but then I heard it again, footsteps, slow, deliberate, not the uneven scurrying of an animal, but something else, something heavier. I held my breath, straining to hear over the rain. The sound was faint, almost lost beneath the downpour, but it was there. Someone or something was walking just beyond my tent. I reached for the small knife I always kept in my bag. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. My heart pounded as I tried to convince myself that it was nothing. Maybe a deer, maybe the rain playing tricks on me. Then I heard it again, closer, I wanted to unzip the tent and look, but something stopped me. A feeling, like the air had changed. The footsteps had been moving toward my truck. I stayed still, listening. The rain made it hard to tell how far away it was, but I could hear something near the truck. A soft metallic sound. The door handle. I swallowed hard. Then silence. No footsteps. No rustling. Just the rain. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. I was frozen, every muscle in my body locked in place. I thought about calling out, but the words never came. Then, another sound. This time from the other side of my tent. A slow, dragging noise. Something moving through the wet grass. I gripped the knife tighter. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. I could hear my own heartbeat now, louder than the rain. And then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence again. The rain still fell, but nothing else moved. I waited, barely breathing. Then I heard my truck door open. I bolted upright. The truck wasn't locked. I never locked it out here, never thought I needed to. My mind raced. If someone was out there, they could be going through my things. Or worse, waiting for me to step out. I stayed still, gripping my knife, my ears straining for any sound. The truck door didn't close. It just stayed open, letting the rain in. I waited. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. Nothing. I forced myself to move, to peek out of the tent. The truck was barely visible in the darkness, its outline lit by flashes of lightning. The door was open, just as I had heard, but no one was there. I scanned the tree line, my pulse hammering in my chest. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. That deep, gut-level feeling that someone was watching. I had to make a decision. Stay in the tent and hope whoever was out there left, or make a run for the truck and get the hell out. I chose the truck. I moved fast, heart pounding, feet splashing through the mud. I climbed into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut, and locked it. The keys were still in the cup holder. I grabbed them with shaking hands and turned the ignition. The engine sputtered, then died. I tried again. Nothing. A cold weight settled in my stomach. I had never had trouble with this truck before. Lightning flashed, and for a split second, I saw something in the rearview mirror. A shape, a figure standing at the edge of the trees, too far to make out details, but close enough to know they were watching me. Then the darkness swallowed them again. I tried the engine one more time, coughed, then roared to life. I didn't hesitate. I threw it into reverse, backing up fast, the tires slipping in the mud. Then I turned onto the dirt road, speeding away from the clearing, away from whatever had been out there. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, my hands gripping the wheel so tight they ached. Only then did I breathe, my body shaking with adrenaline. I never went back to that spot, never even drove near it again. The next morning, after I had calmed down, I told myself it had been a drifter, maybe a thief looking for an easy target, maybe someone just passing through. But deep down, I knew, whoever they were, they hadn't just been passing through. They had been waiting, and I had almost stayed long enough to find out why. I don't know what made me decide to go camping alone that weekend. Maybe it was the stress from work. Maybe I just wanted to be by myself for a while to clear my mind. Either way, I packed up my truck with enough gear for a couple of nights and headed out toward the mountains. The place I had in mind wasn't a proper campground. It was deep in the woods, away from the main trails, a spot I had found a few years back when hiking with some friends. It wasn't on any map, but I had marked it in my head. It was quiet, surrounded by thick forest, and had a small creek running nearby. I figured it would be the perfect place to unwind. The drive took about 4 hours, most of it on winding roads through the trees. The last stretch was a rough dirt path, barely wide enough for my truck. It was the kind of road that made you question whether you should keep going, with deep potholes and loose gravel. I kept driving until I reached a clearing that I remembered from my last trip. The sun was starting to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows through the trees. I killed the engine and got out. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The only sounds were the distant chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves in the wind. It was exactly what I needed. I spent the next hour setting up my tent and gathering some wood for a fire. The temperature was dropping quickly, and I wanted to get the flames going before it got too cold. By the time the fire was crackling, the sun had vanished, leaving only the faint glow of twilight. I sat by the fire, eating a simple meal and watching the flames dance. It was peaceful, almost too quiet. Out there, you start to notice just how loud silence can be. Every creak of a tree, every snap of a twig, makes you listen a little harder. As the night stretched on, the wind picked up, whistling through the branches. I checked my watch, almost midnight. I decided to call it a night and crawled into my tent. The sleeping bag was warm, but the ground beneath me was hard and uneven. I shifted a few times, trying to get comfortable. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I remember was waking up suddenly. At first, I wasn't sure what had startled me. The fire outside had died down to glowing embers, casting faint shadows across the inside of the tent. Then I heard it, a sound in the distance. At first, it was hard to place, just a faint rustling, like wind through the trees. But as I lay there, holding my breath, I realized it was something moving, something walking. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, a deer maybe, but the steps sounded too deliberate, slow, measured, not the quick, darting movements of a startled creature. I reached for my flashlight, but I stopped myself from turning it on. A part of me didn't want to see what was out there. The sound got closer. My heart pounded in my chest. I could hear every breath I took, feel the sweat forming on my skin despite the cold. The steps stopped just outside my tent. I waited. Seconds stretched into minutes. Nothing. Then suddenly, footsteps retreating into the woods. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I just lay there, listening as the sound faded into the distance. When it was finally gone, I let out a slow, shaky breath. I told myself it was probably just an animal, coyote or something, but deep down I knew that wasn't right. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the first light of dawn crept through the fabric of my tent, I finally unzipped the entrance and stepped outside. The ground was damp with morning dew, and the air was still. I looked around, trying to shake the uneasy feeling in my gut. That's when I saw them. Footprints, not boot prints, bare feet. They led from the tree line to my tent and then back into the woods. My stomach turned. I needed to leave. I packed up as fast as I could, shoving everything into my backpack with shaking hands. The whole time, I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees. But no one was there. The drive back felt longer than before. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me down the narrow dirt road. But there was nothing. When I finally made it home, I locked my doors and shut the curtains. I sat on my couch, staring at the floor, trying to make sense of what had happened. I never went back to that spot, and I don't think I ever will. I was never someone who scared easily. I spent most weekends in the woods, camping alone or with friends, and I had been doing it since I was a teenager. I knew how to set up a tent in the dark, how to track game, and how to stay calm in emergencies. The woods weren't something I feared. They were a second home to me, but this time was different. This time I saw something, or rather someone, that I still can't explain. It happened in 2019. I had decided to camp alone for the weekend in a remote forest in Montana. I'd been to this spot a couple of times before, and it was one of my favorites. Secluded, quiet, and untouched by tourists. I packed light. A tent, a sleeping bag, a small cooler with food, and my hunting knife, which I always carried just in case. I didn't plan on hunting, but you never go into the woods without a knife. The drive took about 5 hours from my house. The last stretch was a narrow dirt road winding through thick trees, barely wide enough for my truck. I parked in a small clearing, grabbed my gear, and hiked in a couple of miles until I found a flat, open space near a creek. The sun was beginning to set, casting a deep orange glow through the trees as I set up my tent. By the time I got a fire going, the temperature had dropped. I sat by the flames, eating a sandwich and listening to the sounds of the woods. Crickets, a distant owl, the soft rustling of leaves as the wind moved through the trees. It was peaceful. At least it was at first. About an hour after sunset, I started hearing something else. At first, it was just a faint snap of a twig somewhere behind my tent. Not unusual. Animals move through the forest at night all the time. But then, a few minutes later, I heard it again. Closer. Another snap. Then silence. I sat up, staring into the darkness beyond the firelight. The woods were thick, and I couldn't see much beyond the flickering glow of the flames. I reached for my flashlight, clicked it on, and slowly scanned the trees. Nothing. I told myself it was just a deer or a raccoon, maybe sniffing around for food, but something about it felt off. The woods have a rhythm, an unspoken language. The way an animal moves, the way the forest reacts. I'd spent enough time outside to know when something wasn't right. And right now, something wasn't right. I let the fire burn down a bit, keeping the flashlight in my lap. I wasn't exactly scared yet, but I was alert. I decided to wait, to listen, and then I heard footsteps. Not the quick, light steps of an animal. These were slow, deliberate, and human. They came from the trees maybe 20 or 30 feet away. A soft crunch, then a pause. Another step, another pause. Someone was watching me. I held my breath, barely blinking. The fire crackled beside me, but the woods were silent now. Even the crickets had stopped. I raised the flashlight again, shining it toward the sound. And that's when I saw him, a man, standing just beyond the trees. He was tall, thin. His clothes were dark, and his face was wrong. Like his skin was stretched too tight over his skull. He wasn't moving, just standing there, half hidden in the shadows, staring at me. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I've run into other campers before. People hiking through the woods, hunters looking for game. But this was different. This man wasn't carrying gear.
No backpack, no flashlight, no visible weapon.
He wasn't walking like someone who was just passing through. He was waiting, watching. I didn't move. My hand tightened around my knife. I didn't want to speak. I had no idea how he would react. Instead, I just sat there, staring back at him. A minute passed, maybe 2, and then he turned and walked away. Not hurried, not startled, just slow. He disappeared into the trees without a sound. I let out a shaky breath. My heart was pounding now. Every instinct in me screamed to leave, to grab my things and get the hell out of there. But it was pitch black, and hiking back to my truck in the dark wasn't an option. I would have to wait until morning. So I did the only thing I could. I put the fire out. I sat in the dark, knife in hand, and I waited. I didn't sleep. Every few minutes, I thought I heard something. A faint movement, a shift in the leaves. But nothing ever came close again. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I was already packing. I shoved everything into my bag, barely even bothering to fold my tent. I just wanted to leave. The hike back to my truck felt twice as long. Every few steps, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see him again. But the woods were empty, normal. It wasn't until I reached my truck that I let myself breathe. I tossed my gear into the back, started the engine, and tore out of there, not stopping until I was miles away. I never reported it. What would I say? That some strange man was watching me? That I was scared? It wasn't illegal to be in the woods. But something about him, about that night, has stayed with me. I've been camping hundreds of times, but I've never gone back to that spot, and I never will. I was never the kind of guy who scared easy. I grew up hunting in the deep woods, spending weeks at a time in places where most people wouldn't dare step foot. I had been in storms that felt like the sky itself was cracking open. I had heard the distant howls of wolves in the dead of night. I had seen bears tear through tents for scraps of food. Nothing ever really got to me, but what happened that night in the mountains, what I saw, what I heard, that still follows me. I was 34 then, working a construction job in Montana. The pay was decent, and I had built a life out there. It wasn't much, just a one-bedroom place near the edge of town. But I didn't need much. The mountains were my real home. Whenever I got time off, I'd pack up my gear, drive out into the wilderness, and disappear for a few days. I had a favorite spot about a 5-hour drive from where I lived. It was remote, tucked between two ridges, with a stream that cut through a thick patch of pines. It was perfect. No people, no noise, just the wild. I had been there at least a dozen times before, and every trip was the same. Hike in, set up camp, hunt a little, fish a little, sleep under the stars. Simple. But this time, something felt different from the start. The moment I stepped out of my truck, I noticed it. The woods were quiet. Too quiet. Normally, you hear birds chirping, leaves rustling, maybe a squirrel darting through the underbrush. But there was none of that. Just silence. Thick, heavy silence. I brushed it off. Maybe it was the weather. The sky had that dull gray look, like it was deciding whether to rain or not. I grabbed my pack, checked my rifle, and started hiking. It was late afternoon by the time I reached my usual campsite. The ground was dry, the stream was running strong, and everything looked normal. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and got ready to settle in for the night. Then I found the tracks. They weren't deer tracks. They weren't bear tracks. They looked wrong. At first glance, they seemed like coyote prints. Paws pressed deep into the mud near the water. But the longer I stared, the more I noticed the details. The shape was off. The spacing was strange. The claws were too long, too sharp. And then there was the size. Coyotes weren't that big. I tried to shake it off. Could have been a wolf. Could have been anything. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. By nightfall, the wind had picked up. I got a fire going, cooked a quick meal, and sat by the flames, listening. Still no sounds.
No crickets, no owls.
Just the crackle of burning wood and the wind moving through the trees. Then I heard it. A whistle. Not the kind the wind makes. Not the high-pitched screech of a bird. This was different. It was human. Slow. Deliberate. It came from somewhere deep in the trees. I sat up, gripping my rifle, staring into the darkness. My fire barely reached beyond the first few trees, and past that, there was nothing but black. I held my breath, waiting. The whistle came again. Closer. I wasn't alone. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the trees. The beam cut through the dark, landing on nothing but branches and trunks. But something felt off, like I was being watched. I stayed up for hours, staring into the woods, listening. The whistling didn't come back, but I didn't sleep that night. Morning came and I felt like hell. I had barely closed my eyes, and my nerves were shot. I decided to go hunting, partly because I needed food, but mostly because I wanted to clear my head. The forest felt different in the daylight, less threatening, more familiar. I followed a game trail, rifle ready, moving slow. I was about 2 miles from camp when I saw it. A man. He was standing about 100 yards ahead, half hidden behind a tree. He was tall, skinny, wearing old, ragged clothes. His skin looked wrong, too pale, too stretched. I called out to him, raising a hand. No response. He just stood there. I took a step closer, gripping my rifle. Then he moved, not like a person, not like anything I had ever seen. It was fast, jerky, like his limbs didn't work right. 1 second he was behind the tree, the next he was gone. I spun in a circle, scanning the trees, but he was nowhere, just gone. I should have left right then. I should have turned back, packed up my gear, and gotten the hell out of there. But I didn't. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was dipping behind the ridge. I kept telling myself I was imagining things. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe it was some hiker passing through. I forced myself to eat, forced myself to drink. Then the smell hit me. Rot, like something had died and had been left to bake in the sun. It was strong, overwhelming. It made my stomach turn. I looked around, trying to find the source, but there was nothing. Just trees, my tent, my fire. Then I saw the tracks. They were right by my camp, deep in the dirt. The same ones I had seen by the stream. Something had been here. Something had been watching me. I grabbed my rifle and flashlight, heart pounding. I wasn't running. If there was something out there, I was gonna find it. I moved through the trees, scanning the ground, searching for any sign of movement. The smell was everywhere now, thick and suffocating. Then I heard it. Not a whistle this time. A voice, my own voice, came from deep in the trees, mimicking me, calling my own name. My blood went cold. I turned and ran. I crashed through the underbrush, breathing hard, my flashlight bouncing with every step. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. I never packed up my gear. I never looked back. I just drove. I never went back to that spot. Never even drove near it. A few weeks later, I told a buddy what happened. He grew up on a reservation not far from there. He didn't laugh. He didn't call me crazy. He just nodded and said, "You saw it." I didn't ask what he meant. I already knew. I was 22 when we went on that camping trip, back when life felt like it was just starting. It was supposed to be a break, a weekend away from assignments, exams, and everything else that came with college. There were 4 of us, me, James, Alex, and Tyler. We had been friends since freshman year, always finding some excuse to get away from campus whenever we could. This time, James had the idea to go camping deep in the woods near a lake about 2 hours from where we lived. None of us were expert campers, but we had been on enough trips to know the basics. We packed light, some food, water, a tent, and a few essentials. The plan was simple. Drive out early Friday morning, hike for a couple of hours, set up camp, spend 2 nights, and head back Sunday afternoon. It was supposed to be easy. The drive was long, mostly empty roads lined with thick trees. The further we went, the less civilization we saw. No houses, no stores, not even gas stations for miles. Just the road and the trees. First, it felt exciting. The whole point was to disconnect, to get away from everything. But at some point, maybe an hour into the drive, the silence in the car felt heavier. The trees were too dense, the road too empty. It was like we had left the world behind. We reached the trailhead around noon, parked the car in a small gravel lot, and started hiking. The trail wasn't marked, but James had done his research and claimed he knew where he was going. The path was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side. and the deeper we went, the more overgrown it became. It was clear that not many people hiked this way. The forest was quiet, too quiet. I've been in the woods before, and there's always some kind of noise, birds, insects, the rustling of leaves in the wind. But as we walked, the silence felt unnatural. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. It took about 3 hours to reach the lake. It was beautiful, wide, still, untouched. No docks, no boats, nothing. Just water surrounded by trees. We found a clearing near the shore and set up our tent. The sun was still high in the sky, so we decided to explore a little. Tyler and Alex went to gather firewood, while James and I walked along the shore. That's when I noticed something strange. The ground near the water was soft, damp from where the lake had receded. But there were footprints in the mud, deep, uneven. They weren't ours. They were old but still visible. I couldn't tell how many people had made them, but they led from the tree line to the water's edge and then disappeared. No prints coming back. James saw them too. We looked at each other, but neither of us said anything. It didn't feel worth mentioning. Maybe someone had been here before us. Maybe the water had washed away their return tracks. We went back to camp, built a fire, and settled in for the night. The first few hours were fine. We ate, joked around, and enjoyed being away from everything. But as the night deepened, the unease I had felt earlier came back. The woods felt too still. Even the fire didn't seem to warm the air around us. At some point, Alex mentioned hearing something in the trees. We all went quiet, listening. I didn't hear anything at first, but then, just barely, a sound, soft, slow movement, like someone stepping carefully over dry leaves. Not an animal, too deliberate. James grabbed a flashlight and pointed it toward the trees, but there was nothing, just darkness and the feeling of something watching us. We convinced ourselves it was nothing. We had no reason to be scared. There was no one out here but us. But then the feeling changed. It was subtle at first, like the air had shifted, like the woods themselves were watching us. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. We went to sleep eventually, all of us packed into the tent. I don't know how long I slept, but I woke up to the sound of movement outside. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling the tent. I didn't breathe. The footsteps stopped just outside. Then, the fabric of the tent moved, like something or someone was pressing against it. I wanted to wake the others, but I couldn't move. My body felt frozen, locked in place by fear. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. No more footsteps, no more movement, just silence. I must have fallen asleep at some point because the next thing I remember was waking up to sunlight. I told myself it was a dream. It had to be. But when we stepped outside the tent, the ground was disturbed. There were footprints all around our campsite. They weren't ours. They were fresh. We didn't talk about it. We didn't acknowledge it. We packed up and left without saying a word. The hike back felt longer. The forest felt different, heavier. We moved fast, almost running. By the time we reached the car, my hands were shaking. No one spoke the entire drive home. We never went camping again, and I still don't know who or what was out there with us. I don't know what made me think it was a good idea to camp in that graveyard. Maybe it was boredom, maybe curiosity, or maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that I could. The idea had been sitting in the back of my head for a while, and I finally decided to do it on a cold autumn night. I had been camping alone for years, mostly in the woods, sometimes near old abandoned buildings, but never in a graveyard. Something about it felt different. Not supernatural, not eerie in a fairy tale sense, just wrong. A place where people were buried wasn't meant for the living. It was a place of silence, not of flickering campfires and tents. But I ignored that feeling. I picked a small graveyard off a rural road outside a small town I didn't know well. It was a forgotten place, overgrown with weeds, the kind of cemetery no one visited anymore. There were no fresh graves, just old, crumbling headstones, most too worn to read. The road leading to it was narrow, cracked, and lined with trees whose branches tangled like skeletal fingers. There were no houses nearby, no streetlights, nothing but fields and woods stretching into the distance. I parked my truck on the side of the road, grabbed my gear, and stepped through the rusted gate. The ground was uneven. The graves sunk into the earth over time. Some headstones were leaning, others broken in half. I walked deeper in, picking a spot near the edge where a few tall trees stood, their leaves barely clinging to the branches. I set up my tent between two crooked headstones, brushing away dead leaves and twigs before staking it into the soft earth. My boots sank slightly into the damp ground as I worked. By the time I had everything set up, the sky had darkened into a deep, inky blue. The air smelled of earth and decaying leaves. There was no wind, no rustling branches, no distant sounds of cars or people, just silence. I sat by my small fire, eating out of a can, feeling the cold creeping in through my jacket. It wasn't fear I felt, it was something else, an awareness, a feeling that I wasn't supposed to be there. I forced myself to ignore it. After finishing my meal, I walked around the graveyard with my flashlight. The light cast long shadows, making the graves look deeper, the headstones taller. I read what little I could from the stones. Most were from the late 1800s, a few from the early 1900s. Entire families buried together. Some had no names, just slabs of stone, as if whoever buried them didn't care enough to mark who they were. I found an old mausoleum near the back, its metal door rusted shut. Vines crawled up the sides, gripping the stone like veins. I shone my flashlight through the cracks in the door, but the inside was just darkness. Stale air drifted out, carrying the scent of damp rock and rot. I stepped away, not wanting to linger near it. Back at my tent, I threw more wood onto the fire and sat down, stretching my legs. My breath came out in white puffs. The temperature had dropped fast. The fire crackled, sending embers floating into the black sky. Then I heard something, a single, sharp sound in the distance. A footstep. It came from the trees beyond the graves. I turned my head, holding my breath. Silence. I told myself it was an animal, a deer, maybe a raccoon, but something about it felt deliberate, slow, heavy. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the trees. Nothing. Just the gnarled trunks and bare branches reaching up like dead hands. I sat back down, telling myself to relax, but my body wouldn't. An hour passed, then two. The fire burned low and I let it. The darkness around me felt thicker now, the cold biting deeper. I crawled into my tent, zipping it up tight, wrapping myself in my sleeping bag. My breath sounded too loud inside the thin walls of the tent. Then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it again. A footstep, closer this time. The same heavy, deliberate sound. My heart pounded. I lay still, ears straining, every muscle tensed. Another step, then another, stopped just outside my tent. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. The fabric of the tent shifted slightly, like something brushing against it. I reached for my knife, gripping the handle so tight my knuckles ached. I waited. Nothing. Minutes passed. The fire outside crackled softly, its light flickering against the tent walls. I stayed like that, frozen for what felt like hours. Finally, I heard it move, not away but around. Slow, measured steps circling my tent. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. I wanted to burst out, flashlight in one hand, knife in the other, but something told me not to, so I waited. Eventually, the steps faded. I stayed awake until dawn. When the first pale light crept through the trees, I finally unzipped the tent and stepped out, my knife still in hand. The fire had burned down to cold embers. My truck was still there, my gear untouched, but there, in the dirt around my tent, were footprints. Deep, clear footprints. Boot prints. Not animal tracks. Not bare feet. Boots. Heavy, deep imprints in the soft earth, circling my tent over and over. I followed them with my eyes, my skin crawling. They led toward the woods but stopped just at the edge. There was no trail leading away, no sign of anyone walking off. Just stopped, like whoever it was had stood there, watching me, before vanishing into the trees. I didn't pack up. I didn't eat. I just grabbed my things and left, my hands shaking as I threw everything into the back of my truck. I didn't look back as I drove away. I don't camp in graveyards anymore. I don't camp anymore, not after what happened in the summer of 2015. I used to love it, the quiet, the space, the feeling of being truly alone with nature. But some things, once you see them, change you forever. Back then, I was 34, working a demanding job in construction, and constantly exhausted from the noise and stress of the city. My escape was always the woods. I had been camping solo for years, always picking remote places where I wouldn't run into crowds. That summer, I picked Black Pine Forest, a thick, sprawling woodland in northern Montana, about 3 hours from where I lived. It was the kind of place where people went hunting or fishing, but rarely deep enough to camp for days like I planned to. I left on a Friday morning in my old Ford F-150, packed with enough food, water, and gear for a solid 3-night trip. The road leading into the forest was rough, narrow, winding, and littered with potholes. There were no marked campsites, which was exactly why I chose it. I wanted solitude, nothing but trees, wildlife, and the crackling of a fire at night. I drove about 10 miles into the woods, past an old, half-collapsed cabin that looked abandoned. It was the only sign of human presence I saw before I finally found a clearing that looked perfect. A small stream ran nearby, and the trees were tall enough to provide cover without making me feel boxed in. I spent most of the first day setting up. I pitched my tent, gathered firewood, and cooked some canned chili over the flames as the sun set behind the trees. The first night was peaceful. The wind rustled the leaves, distant owls hooted, and I sat by the fire with a cold beer, feeling like I had finally found some peace. It wasn't until the second day that things started to feel off. I woke up early, brewed coffee over the fire, and spent the day exploring. The deeper I went into the woods, the more I noticed how untouched the place felt. No trails, no footprints, no signs of hunters or hikers, just pure wilderness. By mid-afternoon, I had walked several miles from my camp when I found something strange, a pile of bones. At first, I figured it was just a deer carcass, but as I got closer, I realized they were stripped clean, like something had picked them apart piece by piece. No fur, no flesh, just bones, stacked in a neat pile. That wasn't normal. I stood there for a while, listening. The woods had gone silent.
No birds, no insects.
Just the wind moving through the trees. Then, a branch snapped somewhere behind me. I turned fast, expecting to see an animal, but there was nothing. Just trees and shadows stretching long in the late afternoon sun. My gut told me to leave, so I did. I headed back toward camp, moving fast, gripping the knife on my belt. As I walked, I had this creeping feeling that I wasn't alone. Every so often, I'd hear the faintest rustling behind me, like something moving when I moved and stopping when I stopped. But no matter how many times I turned around, I saw nothing. By the time I got back to my campsite, I felt uneasy. The feeling of being watched hadn't left, and the woods still felt too quiet. I built my fire bigger than usual that night, as if the extra light would keep whatever was out there at bay. I barely slept. Every little noise outside the tent made my pulse spike. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Not the quiet, shuffling steps of an animal. These were slow, deliberate, human. They circled my tent. I held my breath, gripping the hunting knife under my pillow. My heart pounded so hard I swore whoever was outside could hear it. Then, just as suddenly as they came, the footsteps stopped. I didn't move. I lay there, staring at the thin fabric of the tent, waiting. Minutes passed. Nothing. Then an hour. Still nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself I had imagined it and forced myself to get some rest. Big mistake. The next morning, I stepped out of my tent and saw something that made my stomach drop. My cooler was open. The latch was undone, the lid tilted back, and all my food was gone. Not just scattered like a bear had gone through it. Asterisk, asterisk, gone. Asterisk, asterisk, no tracks, no mess, just missing. Then I noticed something else. There were footprints in the dirt around my campsite.
Asterisk, asterisk, bare footprints, asterisk, asterisk.
Human. But the thing that made my blood run cold? They weren't coming from the woods. They led into them. Someone had been here. Someone had stood outside my tent in the night, and they had taken my food. At that point, I was done. I packed up fast, shoving everything into my truck, constantly checking over my shoulder. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. The drive back was nerve-wracking. The narrow dirt road felt longer than before, the trees pressing in on either side. My mind was racing with questions. Who was out there? How long had they been watching me? What would have happened if I hadn't woken up? Asterisk, asterisk, I was about 4 miles from the highway when I saw it. A man, standing just off the road, partially hidden behind a tree. He was tall, thin, and completely naked. His skin was filthy, smeared with dirt. His face was blank, unreadable. He wasn't waving or calling for help, just standing there watching me. I slammed the gas pedal and didn't stop until I hit the main road. I never reported it. What would I even say? A naked guy stole my food and watched me sleep? I told myself it was probably some hermit living off the land. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. Someone, asterisk, asterisk, or something asterisk, asterisk, had been watching me since the moment I arrived. The bones, the footprints, the food, none of it was normal. I haven't been camping since. Not alone. Not deep in the woods. I stick to places with people, trails, noise, because out there in the quiet someone might be watching. And next time, I might not wake up in time to hear the footsteps. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend in the woods. I had driven nearly 5 hours from home to reach a secluded campsite deep in the forests of northern Montana. The place was off the beaten path. No designated campsites, no park rangers, just miles and miles of trees, mountains, and rivers. That was exactly what I wanted. No noise, no distractions, just me, my gear, and the wilderness. I wasn't new to camping. I had done this plenty of times before, even in rougher conditions. The forest had never made me uneasy. It was peaceful in a way that cities and towns weren't. I liked the solitude. I liked the feeling of being out there alone, away from people, away from the world. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky, turning everything gold. The road had been rough, barely more than a dirt path cutting through dense trees. My truck had struggled over the rocks and potholes, but I had finally made it. I set up camp near a clearing close to a slow-moving river. The trees were thick here, towering pines that blocked most of the sky. The air smelled like damp earth and pine needles. It was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no wind, just silence. I noticed that right away, but I didn't think too much about it. Some places were just like that. I pitched my tent, set up my small fire pit, and got everything in order before dark. I wasn't worried about wildlife. I had my rifle, my knife, and a canister of bear spray. I wasn't worried about people either. The nearest town was miles away. No one came out here unless they really wanted to be alone. The first night passed without much trouble. I cooked some food over the fire, listened to the occasional rustling in the trees, and eventually crawled into my tent. The night was cold, and the forest was even quieter than before. The kind of quiet that pressed against your ears. I had trouble sleeping, but that wasn't unusual for me on the first night. The next morning, I woke up early, made some coffee, and decided to go for a short hike. I took my rifle just in case I ran into anything that I shouldn't. The woods were thick, but there were old game trails cutting through them. I followed one, moving deeper into the forest. About an hour in, I noticed something odd. A set of footprints in the dirt. Human footprints. That didn't make sense. I had seen no signs of people out here, no tire tracks, no campsites, nothing. The prints were fresh, too, maybe a few hours old at most. They led off the trail and disappeared into the brush. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. Something felt off, but I shook it off and kept walking. It was probably nothing. Maybe some hiker had passed through recently. Still, I kept my rifle in my hands after that. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was high overhead. Everything looked the same, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. I checked my gear, made sure nothing had been touched. My food was still there, my rifle still where I left it. Nothing was missing, but I still felt it. That feeling of being watched. That night, the forest wasn't silent anymore. I heard twigs snapping, footsteps, not the sound of an animal, not the sound of a bear or a deer, something slower, more careful. I sat in my tent, gripping my rifle, listening. The footsteps circled my camp. Then they stopped. I waited, barely breathing. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. Nothing. Eventually, I forced myself to lie down, to sleep, but I kept the rifle next to me. The next morning, I found something strange. A single footprint, right outside my tent. I hadn't left it. I knew that for sure. It was fresh, pressed deep into the dirt, facing my tent, like someone had been standing there, watching me while I slept. I packed up right then. I wasn't going to stay another night. I started loading my truck, moving fast. The whole time, I felt that prickle on the back of my neck, that feeling of being watched. As I tossed the last bag into the truck bed, I heard something, a whistle, short, sharp, coming from the trees. I turned, rifle raised, scanning the woods. Nothing. I climbed into my truck, started the engine. The tires spun in the dirt, but I got moving. As I drove back down the rough trail, I kept looking in the mirror, and then I saw him, a man, standing at the edge of the trees, just watching. I only saw him for a second before the road curved and he disappeared. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I didn't breathe until I was back on the highway. I don't know who he was. I don't know how long he had been watching me, but I do know one thing. I was never alone in those woods. I don't usually camp alone, but this time I didn't have a choice. I had planned a trip with a friend, but at the last minute, he canceled due to work. I had already taken time off, packed my gear, and mapped out my route. It didn't feel worth canceling over, so I went by myself. It was just 2 nights in the woods, and I had done plenty of solo hikes before. I chose a spot deep in a national forest, far from any major roads, tucked away in the hills of Oregon. It was mid-October, and the air had already started to turn cold. The leaves had changed to bright oranges and yellows, and the crisp air made it feel like the perfect time to be out in nature. I drove down a long, winding dirt road until I reached the spot where I planned to hike in. I parked my truck at the base of the trail and grabbed my pack. The forest was completely silent except for the occasional gust of wind rustling through the trees. I checked my phone one last time, no signal, which wasn't surprising. That was part of the appeal. No distractions, just me and the quiet of the woods. The hike to my campsite took about 3 hours. The trail was rough, overgrown in some spots, but I had studied the map beforehand and knew exactly where I was going. I had picked a spot near a small creek, just off the main trail. It was a secluded area surrounded by thick trees, and it gave me a clear view of the water. It seemed perfect. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and started a small fire as the sun began to set. The temperature dropped fast, and I pulled on an extra layer. Sitting by the fire, I cooked a simple meal and listened to the sounds of the forest. It was peaceful, exactly what I had wanted. But as the night grew darker, that peaceful feeling started to change. First, it was small things. The way the wind seemed to shift unpredictably, or how the trees creaked in a way that almost sounded like voices. Normal forest sounds, but something about them felt off. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night. The fire had burned down to embers, and the cold was creeping in fast. I crawled into my tent, zipped my sleeping bag tight, and closed my eyes. I don't know how long I had been asleep when I woke up to a noise, a distinct, sharp crack, like a branch breaking. I held my breath and listened. Silence. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer moving through the trees. But then I heard another sound, something much closer. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching over the forest floor. I felt my heart start to race. I was deep in the woods, far from any other campers. There shouldn't be anyone else out here. I stayed completely still, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped. Then, nothing. Just the sound of the wind and the distant trickle of the creek. I waited, listening for any other movement. After a while, I convinced myself I had imagined it. Maybe I had been half dreaming. I tried to calm myself down and go back to sleep. But then, maybe an hour later, I woke up again. This time, there was no mistaking it. Something was moving outside my tent. I could hear it shifting, the faint sound of leaves and dirt being disturbed. And then, I felt something press against the side of the tent. I stopped breathing. It wasn't an animal. The pressure was too steady, too deliberate. Someone, or something, was outside, touching my tent. I had a knife in my pack, but it was out of reach. Slowly, carefully, I inched my hand toward it. I gripped the handle tightly, my pulse pounding in my ears. The pressure on the tent stayed for a few seconds, then slowly moved away. The footsteps started again, circling the tent. Whoever it was, they were walking around me. I stayed completely still, gripping the knife so hard my fingers ached. The footsteps stopped on the other side of the tent. Silence stretched out, long and suffocating. Then, without warning, the footsteps moved quickly, away from the tent, into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Every little sound made me jump. I kept the knife in my hand, ready for whatever or whoever might come back. By the time the sky started to lighten, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I didn't care if I had planned to stay another night. Whatever had been outside my tent, I wasn't going to wait around to find out what it wanted. I packed my gear as fast as I could, my hands shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. The woods felt different now. The peacefulness I had felt before was gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of unease. As I started hiking back toward my truck, I kept looking over my shoulder. I didn't see anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear in the back and locked the doors as soon as I got inside. I sat there for a moment, just breathing, trying to steady myself. Then, I noticed something. There, in the dirt near my truck, were footprints. Not mine. They were fresh, leading away from where I had parked, disappearing into the trees. Someone had been watching me from the moment I arrived. I started the truck and got out of there as fast as I could, not looking back. I didn't stop until I reached the highway, miles away from the forest. I still don't know who or what was out there that night. I never went back to that spot, and I never camped alone again. I don't know what made me want to go camping alone that weekend. Maybe I needed to clear my head. Maybe I just wanted some time away from work, from the noise of the city, from people. I'd always been comfortable in the outdoors, having grown up hunting and fishing with my dad. I knew how to handle myself out there. I wasn't some tourist who thought a weekend in a tent would turn me into some kind of survival expert. I picked a spot I'd been to once before, deep in the woods of northern Michigan. It wasn't a marked campsite, just a clearing near a creek, about 5 miles off the nearest road. You wouldn't find it unless you knew where to look. That's why I liked it. No people, no noise, just the sound of the wind through the trees and the water moving over the rocks. I packed light but smart. A tent, a sleeping bag, some dried food, and a .45 in case I ran into a bear. I had enough supplies for 3 days, though I wasn't sure I'd stay that long. I parked my truck on the side of a dirt road, locked it up, and hiked in with my gear. By late afternoon, I had my tent set up and a small fire going. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that settles in after summer fades but before winter fully arrives. Felt good. As the sun dipped below the trees, I ate a quick meal and settled in by the fire. I brought a book, but I wasn't really reading. I was just listening. The woods were alive with sound. Crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, rustling in the underbrush. Normal things. Things that made the forest feel like it had a rhythm, a heartbeat. But then, as the last light faded, something changed. First, I couldn't put my finger on it. The wind had died down, and the normal sounds of the forest seemed to fade. The crickets were still there, but they felt distant, like they weren't part of the same place anymore. I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself it was just my mind adjusting to the dark. Then I heard the snap of a twig. Not close, maybe 50 yards off, deep in the trees. Could have been a deer. But then another snap, closer this time. Not a deer, not something that big. It was moving carefully, slowly. I listened, waiting for the sound of something running off, but it never came. Just that slow, deliberate movement. I turned toward the noise, eyes scanning the trees, but I saw nothing. Just darkness beyond the glow of the fire. I reached for my flashlight, clicked it on, and aimed it toward the sound. The beam cut through the trees, catching the rough bark of the trunks, the tangled undergrowth. Nothing. Still, the feeling didn't go away. That sense that something was watching. I kept the flashlight pointed into the trees, listening. A minute passed, then 2, then another snap. This time, it came from the opposite direction. I spun the light around. Again, nothing. Just trees and brush. I tried to keep calm. I'd spent enough time in the woods to know that animals move at night. It wasn't unusual to hear things walking around, but something about this felt different. I could feel it in my gut. I stayed by the fire for another hour, forcing myself to keep my eyes open. The sounds didn't come back. No more snapping twigs, no more movement. Just the wind, which had picked up again, rustling the dry leaves. Eventually, I convinced myself that it was nothing and crawled into my tent, zipping the flap tight. I kept my gun close just in case. I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember was waking up in the pitch black. took me a second to figure out what had woken me. Then I heard it, breathing, not my own. It was outside the tent, close, so close I could hear the slow inhale, the faint rasp of something exhaling through its nose. I didn't move, didn't even blink. My hand crept toward my gun, fingers closing around the grip. The breathing didn't stop. It was steady, measured. Whatever it was, it wasn't an animal. I knew that now. I stayed like that for what felt like an hour, gun in hand, barely breathing. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the breathing stopped. Silence, not even the wind. I lay there, straining to hear anything. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving away from the tent. Then another sound, something touching the fabric of the tent. Just the faintest brush, but enough to send a bolt of ice down my spine. I gripped the gun tighter, heart hammering. And then, just like that, it was gone. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. Nothing. Slowly, carefully, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire had burned low, casting only a dim light. I swept the gun around, my eyes searching the darkness. Nothing, but the feeling didn't go away. I sat there, back against the tent wall, watching. The fire crackled softly, the only sound in the night. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but I didn't want to step out into the dark. So I waited. At some point, exhaustion won out. I must have drifted off again because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The first thing I noticed was that my firewood pile had been moved. Not scattered, moved. The logs had been stacked neatly, like someone had arranged them on purpose. Then I saw the footprints. They circled my tent, stopping just at the entrance. Bare feet.
No shoes, no tread marks.
Just the shape of toes pressed into the dirt. I didn't pack. I didn't eat. I grabbed my gear, threw it together, and left. I didn't run, but I moved fast. The whole way back to my truck, I felt that same feeling, that weight of being watched. I never saw anything, never heard anything, but I knew something had been out there with me. When I got back to my truck, I locked the doors, started the engine, and didn't stop driving until I hit the highway. I didn't look back. I haven't been back since. I still don't know what I heard that night, what I felt, what left those footprints. But I know one thing for sure. I wasn't alone. I used to love camping alone. It was a way to clear my head, escape the noise of the city, and enjoy the quiet stillness of the woods. I never really found it scary. I grew up around the wilderness, and I knew how to handle myself. Wild animals, the cold, the isolation. None of that ever worried me. But after what happened that night, I don't go alone anymore. This was back in 2019. I was 32 at the time, living in a small town in Oregon. I had an office job that drained me, so whenever I had a free weekend, I packed my truck with my tent, sleeping bag, and supplies, and I drove out into the wilderness. I knew a few good spots deep in the woods, far from any campgrounds or hiking trails, places where I wouldn't see another person for days. That weekend, I picked a spot I had camped at once before, a small clearing near a river, about a 3-hour drive from home. It was October, and the air had that damp chill that comes right before winter. The forecast said there might be rain, but I didn't care. I had a good tent, plenty of dry firewood in the truck, and warm clothes. I got there late in the afternoon. The drive had been quiet, the roads empty. By the time I parked the truck on the edge of the clearing, the sun was already dipping behind the trees. I set up camp quickly. Tent up, firewood stacked, sleeping bag rolled out. Then I sat by the fire and cooked dinner. I remember how peaceful it felt. The only sounds were the crackling fire, the rush of the river, and the occasional rustling of leaves as the wind picked up. The woods were dense, but my clearing was open enough to see a good distance around. No trails led here, no signs of other campers. Just me and the wild. The first strange thing happened after dark. I was sitting by the fire, sipping from a flask, when I heard footsteps. Not an animal moving through the underbrush, actual deliberate footsteps, slow and careful. They came from the trees behind me. I turned fast, shining my flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing, just the trees swaying in the wind. The fire cast long shadows, and for a second, I thought I saw something move just beyond the light's reach. I listened hard. Nothing, just the wind. I told myself it was my imagination, or maybe just a deer stepping through the brush. Still, I kept the flashlight in my lap and my knife close. I wasn't scared yet, just cautious. An hour passed, maybe more. The fire started to die down. I added more wood, watching as the flames caught and crackled. That was when I saw her. She was standing at the edge of the clearing, just barely visible in the firelight. A woman barefoot wearing what looked like a thin, white nightgown. She wasn't looking at me. Her head was tilted slightly to one side, like she was listening for something. I went completely still. My first thought was that she was lost, maybe from another campsite, but there weren't any others for miles. She wasn't dressed for the weather either. It was cold, and she had no shoes.
No backpack. No flashlight.
She just stood there. Then she took a step forward. I didn't move. I didn't say anything. I just watched. Her movements were slow, almost unsteady, like she wasn't sure how to use her legs. She took another step, and another, her bare feet pressing into the damp ground. I felt something in my chest tighten. Something was wrong. She wasn't looking at me, not exactly. It was like she was looking past me, or through me. And then, as the firelight flickered across her face, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Her mouth was slightly open, and her lips were moving. Not speaking, just moving soundlessly. I stood up. As soon as I moved, she stopped. Her head twitched slightly, like she had just noticed me. For a long moment, we stood there watching each other. The fire popped loudly, and she flinched at the sound. Then, just as slowly as she had approached, she turned, and she walked back into the woods. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire high, sat with my back against a tree, and listened. I didn't hear her again, but I knew she was still out there. Morning came, gray and cold. I packed up quickly, my eyes constantly scanning the tree line. As I loaded the last of my gear into the truck, I saw something. Footprints. Bare footprints in the mud, leading from the trees to my campsite and back. I got in the truck and left. I don't camp alone anymore. I had always preferred camping alone. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. I just liked the quiet, the stillness, the feeling of being completely separate from everything.
No emails. No texts.
No noise except for the wind through the trees. That's why I picked a remote valley in Montana for this trip. It wasn't a place you'd find on any tourist lists, just an old, forgotten stretch of wilderness that a friend of mine had mentioned years ago. He said no one really went there anymore, not since the last fire season had scared people off. That was exactly what I was looking for. The drive out took half a day. The last stretch of the road was barely a road at all, just a dirt track cutting through dry brush, twisting between hills. By the time I reached the valley, the sun was already lowering behind the trees, casting long shadows over the grass. It was a beautiful spot. The land dipped down into a small clearing surrounded by pines, with a narrow river winding through. No signs of people, no old fire pits, no broken bottles, just untouched land. I parked my truck off to the side and started setting up camp. I had a simple routine. Get the tent up first, then gather wood, then cook. By the time I was heating up my first meal, the stars were starting to appear. I sat by the fire, eating slowly, listening to the sounds around me. Crickets, the occasional rustling in the trees. Nothing out of the ordinary. Then I noticed something, a sound that didn't belong. It was faint at first, easy to ignore. A soft snap somewhere beyond the trees. A twig breaking. I told myself it was an animal. Maybe a deer. Maybe a raccoon sniffing around. Nothing unusual. But then it happened again. Closer. This time it wasn't just a single snap. It was a slow, deliberate crunching of leaves, the sound of something moving, stepping carefully, but not carefully enough. I set my plate down. My eyes scanned the tree line, but it was dark beyond the glow of my fire. I told myself it was just my nerves. First night out here, alone in the middle of nowhere. Of course, my mind was going to play tricks on me. I let it go, finished eating, threw another log on the fire. The night deepened. The stars grew brighter. The fire burned lower. Then, just as I was about to turn in for the night, I heard it again. This time, the sound wasn't subtle. It wasn't the careful movement of an animal trying not to be heard. It was the unmistakable, steady crunch of footsteps. Not an animal. Someone was out there. I sat completely still, my breath slow and controlled. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. The sound was coming from behind me, just outside the fire's light. I turned my head, but I couldn't see anything. Just the dark shapes of trees standing still against the night sky. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the trees. Nothing. The forest looked the same as before. The branches didn't move. The grass didn't shift. But I knew what I heard. I stayed awake longer than I planned, sitting by the fire, watching, listening. The wind picked up, rustling the branches. But the footsteps didn't come back. Eventually, I convinced myself to go inside my tent. I zipped myself in and laid down, keeping my flashlight close. My knife, too. It took a long time for sleep to come. When I woke up, the fire had gone out. The sky was a pale, early morning gray. Everything looked normal. No signs of anything unusual. But then I stepped out of my tent. There were tracks. Not animal tracks. Not random disturbances from the wind. These were footprints. Clear, distinct. They started from the edge of my campsite and led directly to my tent. Someone had been here. I felt my chest tighten. I scanned the trees, looking for movement. Nothing. I crouched down, studying the prints. They weren't deep. Whoever it was had been moving carefully. But they had circled my tent, stood right next to it. I hadn't imagined it. I moved quickly, checking my truck, my gear. Nothing was missing. Nothing was touched. But that didn't make me feel any better. I should have packed up and left right then. I should have trusted my gut. But I didn't. Instead, I told myself that maybe it was some local hiker passing through. Maybe they saw my fire and got curious. Maybe they meant no harm. So I stayed. The second night was worse. I kept my fire going longer this time. I sat up, listening. Every small noise made my skin crawl. The wind felt sharper, colder. Then, just past midnight, I saw something. A shape at the edge of the tree line. I only caught a glimpse of it, just a brief shift in the darkness. A figure, standing still, watching. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it at the spot. The beam landed on nothing, just trees. But I knew what I saw. My hands were sweating. My breathing was too loud. Every instinct was telling me to leave. But I stayed. I forced myself to sit by the fire, gripping my knife, staring out into the woods. Then the footsteps came back, slow, deliberate, circling my campsite. I spun the flashlight around, trying to catch whatever it was. But every time I turned, the sound shifted. like it was staying just out of sight. I stood up. My heart was pounding. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the footsteps stopped. Silence. A deep, waiting silence. I stood there for what felt like hours, gripping my knife, barely breathing. Then, from the trees, I heard a sound. Not footsteps, not an animal. A soft, low laugh. It was quiet, almost playful, and it came from more than one direction. I didn't wait any longer. I grabbed my keys, my pack, my knife, left my tent and most of my gear behind. I got in my truck and drove. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on paved roads, back in civilization. I never went back for my tent. I never went back to that valley, and I never camped alone again. I had always liked the idea of camping somewhere remote, far from the noise of cities and the glow of artificial lights. The plan was simple: spend a few nights in the wilderness of southern Chile, somewhere deep in the forests along the Andes. I had researched a lot before picking a spot, making sure it wasn't some tourist-heavy area or a place where I'd have to deal with too many people. I wanted isolation, and I found it in the dense forests near the Argentine border. I packed everything I needed: a tent, a sleeping bag, a solid knife, a small axe, enough food for 5 days, and my GPS device, just in case. I didn't expect to need it, but the thought of getting lost in those endless woods made me bring it anyway. I drove as far as I could before the road turned into a muddy mess, barely fit for even an off-road vehicle. From there, I hiked. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and rotting leaves, the ground soft under my boots. I followed a trail for a while, but once I was deep enough into the woods, I veered off, wanting to find a place untouched by anyone else. The deeper I went, the quieter everything got. There was no hum of distant cars, no sounds of people, just the wind pushing through the trees and the occasional rustling of small animals in the underbrush. I walked for hours, stopping only to check my bearings. The sun was starting to dip behind the mountains when I found a spot that felt right. It was a small clearing, surrounded by thick trees on all sides. A river ran about 50 meters away, its water moving slow and dark. The place felt untouched, exactly what I was looking for. Setting up camp took me less than an hour. I pitched my tent under a tall tree, built a small fire, and sat down to eat as the last bit of daylight faded away. The night came fast in the forest. The darkness was heavy, pressing in on me from all sides. My fire felt small, the only thing keeping the blackness from swallowing me whole. At first, the sounds of the night were normal crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, the whisper of wind through the branches. But as the hours dragged on, I started noticing something else. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. Faint movements in the underbrush, just beyond the reach of my fire's light. Soft, almost careful steps. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a fox or some other small predator. But the sound wasn't random. It wasn't the careless rustling of a creature foraging for food. It was slow, deliberate, like someone taking careful steps, like someone watching. I turned my flashlight toward the trees, but all I saw was the thick wall of trunks and branches. Nothing moved. The forest swallowed the light, making it feel weak and useless. I forced myself to ignore it, telling myself that the mind plays tricks in the dark. That's what everyone says, right? I barely slept that night. Every little noise had me on edge, gripping my knife under the thin layer of my sleeping bag. But nothing happened. When morning finally came, I felt ridiculous. It was just the unfamiliarity of the place, I told myself. The isolation. I spent the day exploring, walking farther into the forest, following the river upstream. It was beautiful, untouched. No signs of human activity, no trails, no footprints. It was exactly what I wanted. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was already dipping low. The uneasy feeling from the night before had faded, replaced by exhaustion from the long hike. I built my fire, cooked a quick meal, and settled in for another night. But as soon as darkness took over, the feeling came back. Worse this time. The sounds in the underbrush started earlier, closer. The careful steps, the slow movement just beyond the light. My skin crawled, every instinct screaming at me that something was wrong. I gripped my knife tighter, scanning the darkness. I forced myself to breathe slow, steady. Then, just as I was convincing myself to ignore it again, I heard something different. A soft exhale. Not an animal. Not the wind. It was close. Too close. I shot up, my heart pounding, and shined my flashlight toward the trees. And that's when I saw it. Just for a second. A shape, a figure standing there half hidden behind a tree. Human, but wrong. It was thin, almost too thin, with long arms that hung at its sides. I couldn't make out the face, just the outline of a head, slightly tilted. Watching me, the moment the light hit it, it moved. Fast. Too fast. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone, swallowed by the trees. I stood frozen, my brain trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. My body was screaming at me to move, to leave, but I couldn't. I kept telling myself I was imagining things, that I was just tired. But I knew, deep down, I knew I wasn't alone. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat by the fire, knife in hand, waiting for morning. The sounds never stopped. The feeling never left. Something was out there, circling, watching. The moment the sky started turning gray, I packed up. I didn't waste time eating, didn't stop to think. I just grabbed my gear and started moving. Fast. I didn't follow my original path. I didn't care where I ended up. I just needed to get out. I walked for hours, my legs burning, my breath coming in short gasps. Every now and then, I'd stop listening, waiting, but nothing followed. The deeper into the forest I went, the safer I felt. By the time I reached the edge of the woods, I was exhausted, my body shaking from lack of sleep and adrenaline. I collapsed into my car, locking the doors, my hands still trembling. I never went back. I never told anyone either, because what would I say? That I saw something in the woods? That I felt something watching me? That I wasn't alone? No one would believe me, but I know what I saw, and I know that somewhere, deep in those untouched forests, something is still there, waiting. I don't know why I thought a solo hunting trip in the mountains would be a good idea. Maybe it was the stress of work piling up, or maybe I just wanted some time away from people. I had hunted plenty of times before, but always with my dad or some friends. This time I wanted to go alone. Just me, my rifle, and the cold, quiet wilderness. It was mid-October when I packed up my gear. The location was a dense forest in the northern part of Montana. I had been there before, but only in the summer. This time it was different. The air was sharp. The trees had shed most of their leaves, and the nights were longer than I remembered. I drove as far as my truck could take me, then hiked a few miles deeper into the woods. The plan was to stay for a few days, maybe a week, depending on how things went. I brought a tent, sleeping bag, enough food to last, and of course my rifle. The first day went smoothly. I set up camp near a small clearing, gathered some firewood, and scouted the area for game trails. There were plenty of deer tracks, and I even spotted a few elk prints. By nightfall, I had a fire going and was eating a simple meal. The silence was something I had been looking forward to. No emails, no phone calls, no traffic. Just the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustling of the wind through the trees. But as the night dragged on, I started to feel uneasy. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The stillness was almost too perfect. Every sound felt amplified. The distant hoot of an owl, the snap of a twig far off in the woods. It all seemed sharper, more unnatural. But I brushed it off. I had been in the woods plenty of times. The night just had a way of making things seem bigger than they were. The next morning, I woke up early and set out to hunt. I followed the game trails deeper into the forest, rifle in hand, moving slow, careful not to make too much noise. I found some fresh deer tracks and decided to follow them. A few miles in, I spotted movement up ahead. A large buck, standing perfectly still, its ears twitching. I crouched down, took a deep breath, and lined up my shot. Just as I was about to pull the trigger, the deer bolted. Not because of me, though. Something else had startled it. Something deeper in the woods. I stayed low, scanning the trees, trying to see what had scared the deer off. There was nothing. No movement, no sounds. But I felt it. That same unease from the night before. I wasn't alone out there. I tried to shake it off and continued tracking. The further I went, the more I noticed something strange. Silence. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just dead silence. It was unnatural. Then, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A few 100 feet ahead, in the dirt, were tracks. But they weren't animal tracks. They were human, barefoot, and they were fresh. There was no reason for someone to be walking barefoot this deep in the woods. It didn't make sense. My first thought was maybe another hunter got lost. But why no boots? And why was there only one set of prints? I felt my pulse quicken. Something wasn't right. I turned back and made my way toward camp, moving faster than I probably should have. Every so often, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. But there was no one. When I got back, I checked around camp, but everything was just as I had left it. My gear was untouched. I told myself I was overthinking things, that I had just stumbled onto some old tracks and let my mind run wild. But deep down, I didn't believe it. That night, I kept my rifle close. The fire burned low, casting long shadows through the trees. I barely slept. Every little noise made my heart jump. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was cutting the trip short. It wasn't worth it. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to be around to find out. I packed up fast, throwing my gear into my bag and stamping out the fire. Just as I was about to shoulder my pack, I froze. The barefoot tracks were back, but this time they were right outside my camp. I stood there, staring at them, my stomach twisting. They weren't there last night. Someone had been watching me while I slept. I grabbed my rifle and started moving. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. I just wanted out. The entire hike back, I felt like I was being followed. Every time I stopped, the forest stopped with me.
No birds.
No wind, just silence. At one point, I thought I saw something through the trees. A shape, person, but they moved too fast, vanishing before I could get a good look. I picked up the pace. My truck wasn't far now, just a little further. Then I heard it, a whistle, low, slow, coming from somewhere behind me. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just ran. By the time I reached my truck, my hands were shaking so badly, I could barely get the keys into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I floored it, speeding down the dirt road, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back in town, surrounded by people. Only then did I let myself breathe. I don't know who or what was out there with me. Maybe just some lunatic living off the grid. Maybe something worse. I don't think I'll ever know. But one thing's for sure, I'm never hunting alone again. I had always liked camping. It wasn't the kind of thing I did often, but when I did, I liked the quiet. The stillness of nature, the feeling of being alone in the world with no distractions. It was a break from everything. No phone calls, no emails, just the sound of the wind moving through the trees. It made me feel small in a way that was good, like I didn't matter, like none of the everyday worries really meant anything. That's why, on a long weekend in late September, I decided to pack up and drive out to a remote part of Montana. I wasn't from Montana, but I had done some research and found a place that looked perfect. Miles away from anything, deep in the woods, away from all the tourists. I didn't want to be at a campground, surrounded by other people. I wanted real solitude. The spot I picked was just outside a national forest, about 4 hours from the nearest town. There was an old dirt road leading up to it, barely marked on any maps. I had to download satellite images to even find a path that looked drivable. My truck could handle it, but I knew it would be slow going. That was part of the appeal. If it was hard to get to, I figured it would be empty. I packed everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a rifle just in case of predators, a satellite GPS for emergencies. I had enough supplies to last a few days. My plan was to set up camp near a small creek I had seen on the map, hike a bit, fish, and just enjoy being alone. The drive started out easy, highway for a while, then paved back roads, then gravel. But after a few hours, the road turned rough, narrow, uneven, covered in ruts. It was clear that no one had driven this way in a long time. My truck bounced hard over rocks and potholes. The trees got thicker. The sky seemed to close in. Eventually, the road just stopped, not in a way that felt planned. There was no sign or clearing. It just faded into overgrown brush, like whoever had built it had given up halfway through. I checked my GPS. I was close to the creek, maybe half a mile. I could hike the rest. I got out, stretched my legs, and started pulling my gear from the truck. The air was cool, damp. I could hear birds, the rustling of trees. No signs of other people, no tire tracks, no footprints, nothing. Perfect. I grabbed my pack and my rifle and started walking. The brush was thick, but not impossible. The ground was soft, covered in pine needles. I pushed forward, checking my GPS every few minutes to make sure I was heading the right way. It took longer than I expected, but eventually, I made it. The creek was small but clean. The water moved fast, clear enough that I could see the rocks beneath. The area around it was flat, good for a tent. The trees were dense enough to block the wind, but not so thick that it felt claustrophobic. It was exactly what I wanted. I set up my tent, built a small fire, and sat down to eat. The day passed slow. I fished a little, hiked up a nearby ridge, watched the sun dip behind the mountains. Everything was quiet. By the time it got dark, I was exhausted. I put out the fire, zipped myself into my sleeping bag, and closed my eyes. Then I heard it, a sound, not an animal, not the wind, something moving. I held my breath, listening. It was distant, barely there, but steady. Branches snapping, footsteps in the brush. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't heavy enough. And it wasn't small enough to be a fox or coyote. It sounded human. I reached for my rifle, sat up slowly. The sound stopped. I stayed like that for a long time, waiting, listening. Nothing. Just the wind, the water, the distant call of some night bird. Maybe it had been my imagination. Maybe it was just the woods settling the way they do at night. I lay back down, keeping my rifle close. I didn't sleep well. Every little sound made me open my eyes, but nothing happened. Eventually, exhaustion won out and I drifted off. Morning came. I unzipped my tent, stepped out, stretched. The air was cold. The fire had burned down to ash. Everything looked untouched, normal. But then I saw it. Footprints, not mine. They were fresh, leading from the trees to my campsite, stopping just a few feet from my tent. I stared at them, my heart pounding. They were human. Someone had been here. Someone had walked right up to my tent while I was sleeping, then turned and left. I grabbed my rifle, scanned the trees. Nothing. No movement.
No sounds.
Whoever had done it was gone. I walked the perimeter of my camp, looking for more tracks. They disappeared into the woods, heading back the way I had come. I checked my gear. Everything was still there. Nothing stolen, nothing moved. Whoever it was, they hadn't taken anything. They had just watched. I packed up fast. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe a lost hiker, maybe a hunter checking out my campsite. But my gut told me something was wrong. I wasn't supposed to be here. No one else was supposed to be here. I started back toward my truck. I moved fast, rifle in my hands, eyes scanning the trees. The whole time, I felt like I was being watched. When I finally reached the truck, I threw my gear in, climbed in, and locked the doors. I started the engine. The sound felt deafening in the quiet. I reversed, turning the truck around. The road was rough, but I didn't care. I just needed to go. As I drove, I kept checking the mirrors, looking for movement, for a shadow between the trees. I didn't see anything, but I felt it. I didn't stop driving until I was back on paved road, until I saw buildings, people, gas stations, until I was far away from that place. I don't know who was out there. I don't know why they didn't take anything, why they didn't wake me, why they just stood there. But I know one thing. I wasn't alone, and I never went camping alone again. It had been nearly a year since my wife passed. People told me time would heal, but time only dulled the edges. The weight of it never left. Nights were the worst, lying in bed with nothing but the sound of my own breath, the silence pressing down. We used to go camping together. That was our thing. The quiet, the woods, the fresh air. It made us feel alive. I hadn't been since she died. I wasn't sure if I was ready, but something in me said I needed to go. Not just for her, but for myself. I picked a place we had never been before, somewhere far out, away from people. A small clearing in the woods beside a lake. It was deep in the wilderness, a few hours' drive from town, then a long hike in. Exactly the kind of place we would have picked. It was supposed to be peaceful. The drive was uneventful. The last stretch of road turned to dirt, winding through the trees, narrowing as it climbed into the hills. When the road ended, I parked, grabbed my pack, and started walking. The trail was rough, barely marked. The trees closed in, their bare branches twisting overhead. It was early spring, still cold. No leaves yet, just a forest of skeletons stretching into the sky. The ground was damp, soft underfoot. I hiked for hours. The air was still. No wind, no birds, just the crunch of my boots and the weight of my pack pulling at my shoulders. My body ached, but I kept moving. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was low. The lake was exactly as I hoped, calm, untouched, reflecting the trees around it like glass. The place felt completely isolated. No signs of anyone.
No footprints, no trash.
Just me and the silence. I set up my tent near the tree line, close to the water but not too close. The last thing I needed was waking up to find my gear soaked from the damp air rolling off the lake. After setting up camp, I gathered firewood. It was dry enough to burn, but the cold made everything feel heavier. My hands ached from the chill as I stacked the wood. The sun dipped below the trees, shadows stretching across the ground. The fire crackled, sending little sparks into the air. I sat beside it, staring into the flames, lost in thought. I could almost hear her voice in my head, the way she used to talk about how much she loved the outdoors, the way she laughed when she got dirt on her hands, like a kid playing outside. The night crept in slowly. The temperature dropped. I pulled my jacket tight, ate a quick meal, and sat there, listening to the stillness. Then I heard it, a crunch in the distance, faint, barely there. I told myself it was an animal, a deer maybe. The woods were full of them. But something about the sound made me uneasy. The way it stopped suddenly, like something was standing still, listening. I stayed by the fire longer than I needed to. The warmth was comforting, but I knew I had to sleep. Inside the tent, I zipped up my sleeping bag, leaving just a small opening near my face. I could still hear the fire outside, the occasional pop of wood splitting in the heat. Then came another sound. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. They came from the tree line, moving closer. I held my breath. The fire had burned low, just embers now. The dim glow barely reached beyond the tent. Something was out there. The footsteps stopped. Silence. I waited, every muscle in my body tense. My mind raced through possibilities. A bear? Person? I hadn't seen a soul all day. No other cars at the trailhead. No other campsites nearby. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just listened. Minutes passed, maybe more. Nothing. I convinced myself I imagined it. Maybe the fire crackling played tricks on my ears. Sleep came slowly. At some point in the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. The fire was out. The air inside the tent was freezing. My breath hung in the darkness. Then I heard it again, closer this time. Something or someone was outside my tent. No footsteps now, just breathing. Slow, steady. I could hear it through the thin fabric. The hairs on my arms stood up. My heart pounded so hard I was afraid it would give me away. I gripped the knife in my sleeping bag. I stayed still, listening. The breathing didn't stop. It was right there. I thought about unzipping the tent, but my gut told me not to. Then, as suddenly as it started, the breathing stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I lay there for what felt like hours. My mind screamed at me to move, but my body refused. I barely slept after that. When the first light of morning broke through the fabric, I unzipped the tent, knife in hand. Nothing.
No footprints.
No sign of anything. The ground was damp, soft enough to leave tracks. But there was nothing. Not even my own prints from the night before. I packed up quickly, keeping my knife out. The feeling hadn't left me. Something had been there. I knew it. The hike back to the car was faster than it should have been. I moved without stopping, barely looking around. Every sound made my pulse jump. When I reached the car, I threw my gear in the back and locked the doors the second I got in. I sat there for a moment, hands on the wheel, breathing hard. I didn't look back. I don't know what was out there. I don't think I want to know. All I know is that I won't be going back. Not to that place. Not alone. Maybe not ever. I always liked being alone in the woods. There was something peaceful about being out there. Just me, my tent, and the sound of the trees swaying in the wind. I had been camping alone for years, ever since I was old enough to carry my own gear. I didn't go to the fancy campgrounds with picnic tables and public bathrooms. I liked to hike deep into the wilderness, where I wouldn't hear another person for miles. That's how I ended up in those woods that night. It was late September, and I had driven a few hours out of town to a forest I had camped in before. I parked my truck on the side of an old logging road and hiked in about 6 miles. The weather had been fine all day, cool, cloudy, but no rain yet. I knew a storm was coming, but I had checked the forecast, and it was just light showers. Nothing serious. By the time I set up camp, the sun had started to go down. My tent was an old but reliable one, set up between 2 thick pine trees. I had my sleeping bag rolled out, my small camp stove set up a few feet away, and my pack leaned against a log. Everything felt normal, just like every other trip I had taken. The first sign that something was wrong came when I noticed how quiet it was. Normally, the woods were never silent. You always heard something: crickets, the distant call of an owl, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. But that night, there was nothing, just the occasional whisper of wind moving through the trees. I told myself it was fine. Sometimes animals went quiet before a storm. It didn't mean anything. Then the rain started. At first, it was just a light drizzle, tapping against the fabric of my tent. I was inside, lying on my back, staring at the thin nylon ceiling. The sound of the rain was actually nice, calming in a way. But as the minutes passed, it started coming down harder. I could hear it hitting the leaves outside, heavy drops smacking against the damp ground. I wasn't worried. My tent was waterproof. I had a rain cover over it. Everything was fine. Then I heard the first sound. It wasn't the rain. It was something else. A faint rustling outside, like someone or something moving through the underbrush. I sat up, listened. The rain made it hard to hear anything clearly, but I was sure I had heard something. A soft, deliberate movement just outside my tent. I reached for my flashlight, clicked it on. The thin yellow beam cut through the darkness, lighting up the fabric walls of my tent. I hesitated for a second, then unzipped the flap just enough to peek outside. Nothing, just wet trees, rain-soaked ground, and the darkness of the forest stretching beyond my little clearing. I pulled the zipper shut and lay back down. Maybe it had been a branch falling, or some small animal moving through the underbrush. I was letting my imagination get to me, but then I heard it again, closer this time. A slow, careful movement, not fast, not random like an animal darting around. It was too deliberate, too controlled. I turned off my flashlight, held my breath, listened. The sound stopped. The rain continued, hammering against the tent, dripping from the trees, soaking the earth. But whatever I had heard, whoever I had heard, had gone silent. Minutes passed. My muscles were tense, my mind racing through possibilities. Person, a deer, some other animal, then another sound. Not rustling this time, not movement, breathing, just outside my tent. Deep, slow, deliberate. Someone standing just beyond the thin fabric walls, close enough that I could hear them breathing through the rain. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. My brain screamed at me to do something. Grab my knife, turn on my light, yell, but I couldn't. I was frozen, listening to that slow, steady breathing. Then nothing.
No retreating footsteps.
No more movement, just the sound of the rain. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Maybe minutes, maybe an hour. My body was locked in place, every muscle coiled, my ears straining for the smallest sound. But there was nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been my imagination. The rain could play tricks on your ears. I was out here alone. My mind was wired to expect danger, and I was overreacting. I forced myself to lie back down, closed my eyes, tried to slow my breathing. Then, something pressed against the side of my tent. I felt it. Not a branch, not the wind, but something solid. A hand, a palm pressing against the fabric, just inches from my face. I shot upright, heart hammering in my chest. The pressure disappeared. Silence. I fumbled for my knife. My fingers wrapped around the handle, gripping it so tightly my knuckles ached. The rain pounded against the tent. The wind picked up, rattling the branches overhead. I waited, every nerve in my body screaming. Then footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving away, not running, not even hurried, just walking like whoever it was knew I wouldn't follow. I sat there for hours, knife in my hand, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. By the time the rain let up, the sky was turning gray with the first light of dawn. I didn't pack up. I didn't eat. I just grabbed my essentials, shoved them into my bag, and left my tent behind. I walked straight back to my truck, checking over my shoulder the whole way. When I finally reached the road, my truck was still there. No signs of anyone, no footprints in the mud, no broken branches. But as I unlocked my door and climbed inside, I noticed something. The handle on the driver's side door, wet from the rain, had a single, smeared handprint on it. A handprint too big to be mine. I locked the doors, started the engine, drove away without looking back. I never went back to that forest, never even drove past it again, and I never camp alone anymore. I don't know why I agreed to it. Maybe I was trying to prove something to myself. Maybe I just wanted to feel something different. Either way, I set up camp in a graveyard that night, and I regret every second of it. It was 2013, and I had just turned 27. I was traveling alone through a stretch of rural countryside, far from anything that mattered. I liked solitude, always had. I didn't mind being in the middle of nowhere, just me and my gear, setting up a tent in places that most people wouldn't dare to. I had camped on cliffsides, in abandoned buildings, even deep in the woods where no trails existed. But I had never once camped in a graveyard. That wasn't the plan, though. I had been driving for hours, trying to reach a campsite near a river, but the roads twisted in ways I didn't expect. By the time I realized I had taken the wrong route, the sun had already set. I pulled over, looking for any place flat enough to set up for the night. That's when I saw it. It wasn't a big graveyard, just a small, fenced-in plot of land beside a dirt road. There were maybe 20-30 gravestones at most, unevenly scattered under a canopy of overgrown trees. The place looked old, like it hadn't been visited in years. The names on the stones were faded, the fence rusted and bent in places. The air was thick, heavy. Even from the car, I could tell it was one of those places that time had forgotten. I told myself it didn't matter. It was just land, the same as anywhere else. The dead wouldn't mind. It was quiet, hidden, and most importantly, empty. I pulled my car off the road, grabbed my bag, and climbed over the broken section of the fence. The ground was uneven, soft in places, but I found a decent spot near the edge, away from most of the graves. I set up my tent quickly, keeping my head down, focusing on the routine. Tent up, sleeping bag inside, food unpacked, fire started. Simple, normal tasks, but the whole time I felt something. Not a presence, not a fear, just something. Like the air was pressing against me just a little harder than usual. I shook it off and forced myself to eat. The fire was weak, barely more than a flickering glow, but I didn't want to build it any bigger. I wasn't sure why. Maybe I didn't want to disturb the place too much. Maybe I was just being respectful. Either way, I kept it small. As I ate, I tried not to look at the gravestones, but my eyes kept drifting back to them. Some were tilted, leaning at strange angles. Some had sunk halfway into the earth, names barely legible. There was no pattern, no organization. It felt haphazard, almost careless, like whoever had buried these people hadn't planned for anyone to come back. The night was quiet, too quiet. I had camped in deep forests, where the silence was natural, peaceful. This wasn't the same. It wasn't the silence of nature. It was the absence of sound. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant animals. Just stillness. Even my own breathing felt too loud. I told myself it was fine. I had been in places like this before, places that felt off for no reason at all. I convinced myself that the only real danger was my own mind. So I zipped up the tent and lay down, staring at the thin fabric above me. I don't know how much time passed before I heard it. A soft, distant thump. It wasn't loud. It wasn't close. But it was there. I sat up, holding my breath, listening. Another thump, a little closer. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer stepping through the brush. But there was no brush. The ground here was soft dirt, uneven but clear. There was nothing to step on, nothing to make a sound like that. I stayed still, waiting. Then it came again. Thump. It was slow, rhythmic, like footsteps, but not normal ones. They were too heavy, too deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent just an inch, enough to shine the light out. The graveyard was empty. Nothing moved. The gravestones cast long shadows, stretching across the dirt like fingers reaching for something unseen. I listened for a long time, but the sound didn't come again. I lay back down, forcing myself to breathe normally. Maybe it had been my imagination. Maybe I had just shifted in the sleeping bag and mistaken the sound. I closed my eyes, and then thump, right outside the tent. I froze, my body locked up, every muscle screaming at me to move, but I couldn't. The sound had been close, too close. I could feel it. Something was there, just inches away. I waited. The tent fabric didn't move. Nothing pressed against it. Nothing brushed against it. But I knew. I knew something was standing right there. I wanted to reach for the flashlight, but I was afraid. Afraid that if I moved, whatever was out there would hear me. Afraid that if I shined the light, I would see something I didn't want to see. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I didn't sleep. I just lay there, frozen, waiting. Eventually, the first light of dawn crept through the fabric. The night had passed. I unzipped the tent slowly, carefully. The graveyard looked the same. Empty, normal. Nothing was disturbed.
No footprints.
No broken branches. Nothing. But then I looked at my car. The driver's side door was open. I know I locked it. I know I did. I packed up without eating, without thinking. I grabbed my gear, shoved it into the back seat, and got in. I didn't even check the back seat. I just turned the key and drove. I didn't stop until I was miles away, parked outside a gas station, my hands still shaking on the wheel. I got out, stretched my legs, and opened the back door to check my gear. Everything was there. Nothing missing. Nothing moved. Except for one thing, a small pile of dirt, right in the middle of the back seat. I don't camp in graveyards anymore. I was never one to go camping alone. I liked the idea of solitude, but something about being out in the middle of nowhere without another person around always made me uneasy. That's why I usually went with a group of friends or at least one other person. But that year, things were different. Life had been stressful and I needed to get away. The kind of exhaustion I felt wasn't something a weekend at home could fix. I needed quiet. I needed nature. It was late in the season, early October, and most people had already packed away their camping gear for the year. The days were still warm enough, but the nights were getting colder. That meant fewer people in the woods, fewer disturbances. I figured if there was ever a time to try solo camping, this was it. I chose a spot in a national forest, a place I'd been before but never alone. It was a good distance from any town, but there was a small trail that led to a clearing beside a lake. The last time I'd been there, I remembered thinking it was the perfect place for a peaceful getaway. That thought stuck with me, and so, early Friday morning, I packed up my gear and drove out. The drive was uneventful. Miles of winding roads, the occasional abandoned barn or house standing in the distance, the kind of rural nothingness that made you realize just how big the world was. The last stretch of road was a dirt path that seemed rougher than I remembered, but my truck handled it fine. I pulled up to the small clearing near the lake, shut off the engine, and stepped out. The place was just as I remembered. The water was still, reflecting the trees that surrounded it. There was no wind, no birds, just silence. I walked around for a bit before setting up my tent. Felt strange being alone. Normally, there would be voices, movement, the clatter of someone unpacking gear. Instead, it was just me, the sound of my own footsteps crunching against the ground. By late afternoon, my camp was set up. A fire pit was built, my tent was secured, and my supplies were in order. I spent the rest of the day fishing by the lake. The quiet was nice at first, but after a while, it started to feel unnatural. I wasn't used to it. As the sun set, I cooked my catch over the fire, ate, and sat back, staring into the flames. It had been a while since I'd been this disconnected from everything. No phone service, no distractions, just me and the woods. Then I heard it, a soft rustling in the distance, barely audible over the crackling fire. I looked up, my eyes scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer maybe. I went back to tending the fire, but the feeling lingered. That strange sense that I wasn't alone. The night dragged on. I stayed up longer than I normally would, keeping the fire going. When I finally crawled into my tent, I lay there listening. The sound of the water, the occasional snap of a branch in the distance. I reminded myself that I was in the woods. Of course, there would be noises. At some point, I fell asleep. I woke up in the middle of the night. Something was off. I wasn't sure what had woken me, but the silence felt heavier than before. I listened. The fire had burned low outside, its glow flickering against the walls of the tent. Then I heard it again. Soft footsteps. Slow. Careful. They weren't close, but they weren't far either. Just beyond the reach of the firelight. I held my breath, my mind racing. There wasn't supposed to be anyone out here. The nearest campsite was miles away. Who the hell would be walking around in the middle of the night? I stayed completely still, listening. The footsteps stopped. I reached for my flashlight, my hand moving slowly. I didn't want to make a sound. When I finally gripped it, I clicked it on and pointed it toward the tent door. Nothing, just the fabric of my tent, slightly illuminated. I considered unzipping the door, looking outside, but something in me said not to. Instead, I waited. Minutes passed. The fire outside crackled again, shifting with the slight breeze. Then the footsteps started again. This time they were moving away, slowly, deliberately. I sat there, listening as they faded into the distance. My heart was pounding. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When the sun finally came up, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The fire had burned out completely, leaving only cold embers. The woods were quiet, just as they had been the day before. But as I looked around, I saw them. Footprints. They weren't mine. They circled my camp, moving close to the fire, then away. I followed them a few yards before they disappeared into the trees. Whoever had been walking around my camp hadn't come from the trail. They had come from deeper in the forest. I packed up immediately. I didn't waste time making breakfast, didn't bother taking my time with anything. The drive back felt longer. Every mile between me and that campsite felt like a weight lifting off my chest. I never went back there, and I never camped alone again. It was late September when I decided to go camping alone. I wasn't new to it. I had done plenty of solo trips before, deep in the wilderness where I wouldn't see another soul for days. I enjoyed the solitude, the fresh air, and the quiet. This time, I had picked a spot deep in the forests of British Columbia, somewhere off an old logging road that had long been abandoned, the kind of place where you wouldn't expect to run into anyone. I had planned to stay for 3 nights, just me, my tent, and the surrounding trees. I packed light but had all the essentials. Plenty of food, water, a good sleeping bag, and my rifle, which I always brought with me in case of bears or cougars. I didn't expect trouble. I never did. I got there in the afternoon, parked my truck as far off the overgrown road as I could, and hiked about a mile deeper into the woods before setting up camp near a small stream. It was the perfect spot. The trees were tall and thick, blocking the wind, and the sound of running water was calming. I spent the evening gathering firewood, cooking up a quick meal, and sitting by the flames, enjoying the silence. The first night was uneventful. I heard the usual sounds of the forest: owls hooting, branches rustling in the wind, the distant calls of animals moving through the darkness. I slept well, my rifle next to me just in case. It was the second day that things started to feel off. That morning, I decided to hike a little further into the woods, just to see what was out there. I had a GPS with me and marked my campsite before heading out. The trees were dense, the ground uneven with thick roots and rocks poking out from the dirt. I walked for about an hour before stopping at a small clearing to take a break. That's when I noticed something. Footprints. Not mine. They were old, maybe a few days, but they were definitely from a boot. Too large and deep to be an animal. I crouched down, studying them. The person had been walking in the same direction I had come from. That didn't sit right with me. I hadn't seen any vehicles, no tire tracks, nothing to suggest anyone had been out here recently. I shook it off. It was probably an old hunter's trail. This was the kind of place people came to for hunting season. Still, it left me with a strange feeling in my gut. I turned back, making my way toward camp. I wasn't scared, just more aware of my surroundings now. When I got back, my campsite looked the same as I had left it. My gear was untouched, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That evening, I built up the fire early, making sure I had plenty of wood to keep it going through the night. As the sun dipped below the trees, the air grew colder, and the sounds of the forest changed. It was always like this, the shift from day to night when the birds went quiet and the nocturnal creatures took over. But there was something else, a different kind of silence. I sat by the fire, listening, my back against a fallen log. Normally, I could hear insects buzzing, small animals scurrying through the underbrush. Not this time. It was too quiet. Then the smell hit me. It wasn't the fire. It was something else, something foul, like rotting meat. It was faint but unmistakable. My stomach turned. I grabbed my rifle, scanning the darkness beyond the fire's glow. My headlamp didn't reach far, only illuminating twisted branches and the thick trunks of trees. I sat there for a long time, listening. Nothing. Then, just as I was about to dismiss it as my imagination, I heard a sound. A branch snapping. Close. Too close. I gripped my rifle, my body tensing. I couldn't see anything, but I knew something was out there, just beyond the trees, watching. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, my heart pounding in my chest. The smell never went away. Eventually, exhaustion took over. I forced myself into the tent, rifle still in my hands. I barely slept, listening to every little noise, waiting. But nothing happened. By morning, the feeling of unease had settled deep in my bones. I knew something wasn't right. I had camped alone too many times to ignore my gut. I decided to leave a day early. I packed up my gear, doused the fire, and started hiking back toward my truck. The whole time, I felt like I was being watched. The smell was gone, but the woods were still too quiet. It was like the entire forest was holding its breath. When I finally reached my truck, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I threw my gear in the back, got in, and locked the doors. That's when I saw it. Across the road, standing half hidden behind the trees, was a man. He was tall, thin, wearing old, dirty clothes. His face was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes. There was something wrong with his eyes. He was staring at me, not moving, not blinking, just watching. I didn't hesitate. I turned the key, the engine roared to life, and I hit the gas. My tires kicked up dirt as I sped down the old road, my hands gripping the wheels so tightly they hurt. I didn't stop, not until I was miles away, back on the main highway, where the forest finally thinned out. Only then did I let out the breath I had been holding. I don't know who he was. I don't know how long he had been watching me. But I do know one thing, I wasn't alone out there.